So let's pick up the discussion on point number 17 of, I think there's 25 points or something like that. This is where I basically left off with last week, is Dr. Brown says, in the same way, pre-trib teachers tell us that the Greek verb gather in Matthew 24:31 speaks of the gathering of the elect at the end of the tribulation, at the time of the Parousia of Jesus. And I provided my answer here in the, my answers are in gray until I highlight them here on the screen, but they're basically in gray. And I said, Dr. Brown here means to imply that pretribbers hold to a gathering at the end of the 7-year so-called tribulation. A gathering they believe is for National Israel instead of for the Christian church. We Prewrathers hold that Matthew 24:31 is the rapture, which will be followed by the day of the Lord. We do not believe that this verse is describing the second coming at the end of the 7-year period. So basically, when we talk about verses like Matthew 24:30, let me scroll down to 31 really. So we've got this section of scripture here. I'm just going to read the whole section because it's relevant. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet blast, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Pretribbers do not believe that this gathering in verse 30, this coming in verse 30 and the gathering in verse 31, they do not believe that this is the rapture. Because if this were the rapture, then this means that the church would have gone through the tribulation. Because verse 29 clearly says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. So because the pretribbers have to remove the church from this time period in a secret, signless, anytime imminent rapture, they then describe what we're reading here in verse 29, verse 30 and 31 as the second coming of Jesus for Israel at the end of the 7 years, and then the church will return with Christ to fight in the battle of Armageddon with Antichrist, like Revelation chapter 19, something like that. Well, comparatively, if you ask the Posttribbers, what are verse 30 and 31 speaking about? What event is this gathering? What is this coming of the Son of Man on the clouds and the gathering of the elect? Ask a Posttribber what's going on. The Posttribber will tell you essentially that this is Jesus' description of a single coming at the end of the 7 years, and this coming is a combination of what Christians call the rapture and what Christians call the second coming. So it's important that you see that Matthew 24, for a post-tribber, is describing both of those events as one event. And the power of their argument, and I've got to go with this part as well. The power of their argument is that all throughout the New Testament, when we talk about the coming of the Lord, the eschatological coming of the Lord, the word parousia, used in a singular fashion, describes this coming. And that's a very powerful argument that the post-tribbers don't seem to follow through. They allow for a second coming and then a third coming, separated by 7 years, disconnected from one another because they live in two different dispensations. A rapture on the front end of that 7 years, a second coming at the far end, although really second coming there should be labeled third coming because it's practically speaking it is a third time. So what do we Prewrathers make of that? And that's why you saw my answer. We believe that this event spoken of in Matthew 24, 30 and 31 is the rapture. So like the post-tribbers, we do believe that this is the rapture, but unlike the post-tribbers, we don't believe that this is the second coming, so-called. And I mentioned 2 weeks ago, because we took a break for last week because of the high holy days, but 2 weeks ago and even 3 weeks ago, I mentioned that the word second coming actually isn't in the Bible. Just like the word rapture isn't in the Bible, the word second coming actually isn't in the Bible. But we know that Jesus came into the world once, 2,000 years ago. And so by using deduction, we can speak of his coming later. In other words, in the future, we can speak of that as the second coming, even though we don't have those two words back to back in a neat one verse that just says second coming. But let me digress just for a split second and show you a verse that probably comes close to doing that very thing. It is Hebrews chapter 9. I want to show you something I stumbled across. I wasn't really even looking for it. It just kind of jumped up into my face as I was doing a different study on a different topic. In Hebrews chapter 9, the writer is talking about the efficacy of the sacrifice of Yeshua and how that the sacrifice of Yeshua is that which we need to now latch onto with faith, with a perfect assurance, so that we can be comforted in this time. He was speaking to readers at the time who were going through persecution at the hands of unbelieving National Israel. They were probably Jewish people who were holding to their faith in Jesus, but not quite understanding how that the bigger picture of sacrifices fits together with the bigger picture of Yeshua. So I don't want to go in that direction, but I do want to highlight and show you something that is right in the middle of this writer to the book of Hebrews is talking about Jesus' presence on earth at that time. And then in the middle of his teaching, he mentions Jesus coming a second time. So look at the wording here, starting in verse 23 and reading to the end of the chapter. So reading through verse 28, just this 5 verses. He says, and I think I'll highlight like this so you can see what I'm reading. He says, therefore, it was necessary for the copies of the things in the heavens to be cleansed with these things. So he's talking about Jesus' first coming. So you have to catch the context. But the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. Verse 24. For Christ did not enter a holy place made by hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear, we're going to look at that word appear later on, in the presence of God for us. Verse 25. Nor was it that he would offer himself often as the high priest enters the holy place year by year with blood that is not his own. Verse 26, otherwise he would have needed to suffer often, we're reading from NESB, since the foundation of the world. And then look at the wording in verse 26. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been revealed to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Now, verse 27, and just as it is destined for people to die once, and after this comes judgment. Now look at verse 28. So Christ also, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time for salvation without reference to sin to those who eagerly await him. Now, you're asking me, Ariel, what in the world does this passage have to do with a rapture? Why are you bringing this up? Okay, here's why I'm bringing it up. In the Pretrib model, Jesus came once into the world 2,000 years ago. And then in their model, he's going to come again at the beginning of the 7 years to rapture his church in a secret, unannounced, anytime, imminent, signless rapture that happens so fast that no one else notices it. Only the Christians notice it. But it is, make no mistake, it is a coming of the Lord, but not to earth. But it is a coming. It has to be an appearance of Jesus into human history, and it has to be significant enough to do two things. It has to remove the living saints from planet Earth, and it has to resurrect all the dead saints. That is a significant event. So it's no small event. And yet, the Pretribbers are going to be so bold as to say that one more time, 7 years later, Jesus is going to come back to earth, and there will be another significant event. He's going to do battle with Antichrist and put away the man of sin, and finally establish his 1,000-year kingdom on earth. Again, a very significant event, because Jesus will be returning to earth, not this time for his church, but with his church, according to Pretrib theology. So when we zoom out and look at all of these major activities that Jesus has performed, from their perspective, there are basically three significant events, three significant itinerary events that happen. Even if they call only one of them the first coming and one of them the second coming, and they give the rapture a nameless designation, meaning they don't call it a first, or they don't call it a coming. They just call it a rapture. But when we take that model and compare it to what the writer of the book of Hebrews just talked about, it's apparent that in what the writer of the book of Hebrews was talking about, there are only two significant comings or arrivals or appearings of the Lord. And we read them here. He said in verse 24 that Christ did not enter a holy place made with hands, a mere copy of the true one, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God for us. And when we look up that word appear, it is Strong's number 1718, emphanizo, and it just means to exhibit, to appear in person, to declare, to make visible, hence manifest. We can just say that this is a somewhat appearance to perhaps make a declaration, or appearance to notify someone, to disclose some information. So it's got a kind of a nuance to it, but to manifest, exhibit, to view, to manifest oneself to something. So I like the fact that the writer to the book of Hebrews, sorry, I'm on the wrong tab there. Let's go there. That the writer to the Hebrews said that Jesus appeared at the end of the ages. Later on down, he says, where does it say? Here we go. Verse 26. But now, once at the consummation of the ages, he has been revealed to put away sin. And when did that happen? That happened at the 2,000-year mark when, and he clarifies it here, he says, by the sacrifice of himself. In case someone might think, well, maybe that's an eschatological revealing, putting away of sin. But he says, no, by the sacrifice of himself. So verse 26, coupled with what we read earlier in verse 24, where he appears in the presence of God for us, these activities up to verse 26 are unmistakably the first coming of Messiah. And even though we don't have the word first or coming like that mentioned, we do have the revealing, to being revealed to put away sin, and the appearing in the presence of God. We have all those things describing what happened the first time. Therefore, logical deduction, we know that this is the first coming. But it's within that context that we now have verse 27 and 28, which read, and just as it's destined for people to die once, and after this comes judgment. Notice verse 28. So Christ, having also been offered once to bear the sins of many, will do what? Appear. And in verse 28, the word appear is not the same as we saw earlier. Earlier it was Strong's, let me scroll back up. It was Strong's number 1718, emphanizo. That is the word to exhibit or to appear or to declare, appear in person, to make visible. But the second usage in verse 27 is Strong's number 5319. Phaneroo is the verb, and it means to make visible, to make clear, to make manifest, to make known. So yes, there are some nuanced similarities between the two words, but my point is simply they are two different Greek words, but they don't have to be two drastically different meanings in terms of appear. They both translated appear in our English, right? You can see it's appear right there in verse 28, and then up in verse 25, it's a different word. In fact, let me bring in the little tool so you can see it that way. So you have appear right here in verse 24, and then when we get down here to verse 28, we have appear a second time. So here are the two words for appear. Now, here's the kind of the meat of why I'm bringing this up. I've said that the word second coming doesn't show up in the Bible in so many words where the word second and the word coming are in close proximity enough to each other that we can actually say, oh, this is second coming. But notice where in verse 28, when it says Christ will appear, notice that it says he will appear a second time. Did you guys catch it? He will appear a second time. So in the Greek, well, in the interlinear, let's see, did I pull it up? I didn't pull it up. But if I were to pull up the interlinear for second, it's the Greek word deuteros, from where we get the English name of our fifth book of the Bible in our fifth book of the Bible of the book of Moses, Deuteronomy, which means second law. So Deuteronomy, second law. So deuteros is the Greek word for deuteros, or deuteros is the word for second. And I thought that was interesting that within one verse we have what we could call now the second appearance. So Christ, having also been offered once to bear the sins of many, as second appearance he will appear a second time, a second appearance. For what? For salvation without reference to sin to those who eagerly await him. The context tells us that it's clearly not the first coming. It's the second coming. It's the second appearance. And so I thought, okay, here we go. Without saying that the word second, we don't actually have to say second coming, but we could say he will come a second time for salvation. It's clear that the context is the second time. Also notice that it says deuteros. It doesn't have the Greek word for third, right? Which means the Pretrib version that says that the rapture is not part of the second coming has to make a case for the rapture being outside of this second coming in some way. And yet the Bible doesn't teach that there's this rapture that's disconnected from the second coming. Remember, Dr. Brown's point in this debate with Pastor Walker is that there's not a stitch of evidence for a second coming and a third coming, two disconnected events. Rather, the Bible speaks of a second appearance, a second coming, a second arrival, the revealing of the Lord from heaven. And if you go from the beginning of the New Testament to the end, there doesn't seem to be any hint that there's going to be a second and a third. Rather, the Bible speaks of this glorious event that happens near the end of the age as a single event. The Parousia is a singular event as well. So I have to give it to the Posttribbers this time to say that, yes, you're right. The Bible seems to speak unmistakably of a second event that will bring Christ into Earth's history, historical activities once again in a significant way. And yet, how can I say that and yet at the same time believe that the rapture and the second coming, so-called second coming, are separated at least by the Day of the Lord activities? Okay, so you're thinking, oh, Ariel, your Prewrathers, are you falling apart? All right, let's go back to my discussion with Dr. Brown and let's finish this out. All right, I'll answer those charges later on. I'll talk about those. Dr. Brown says, verse number 18, I made these numbers. These are not Dr. Brown's numbers. I made up these numbers. This is just so I can track what he says and then what I respond to it a little easier. Here's what he says. Then they tell us, he's speaking of the Pretribbers. They are the Pretribbers in his answer here. Then they tell us that in 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 1, the identical Greek noun for the gathering of the elect at the Lord's Parousia is speaking about the secret rapture 7 years earlier. So he had this humorous quibble, complaint of Pastor Walker, where he says, basically, we Christians are looking for the glorious Parousia of the Lord before the 7-year tribulation, and then 7 years later we're looking for the glorious Parousia of the Lord. In other words, it makes the Bible into a nonsensical book if we don't understand that Parousia is just once. There's one Parousia. There's not two Parousias. There's one Parousia, and the Parousia involves the coming of the Lord. But the Pretribbers have to make this case that there's a Parousia before the 7 years and then a Parousia at the end of the 7 years, and they do like exegetical gymnastics to get to that. That's kind of what Dr. Brown's getting at, where he's saying that if you look at all the verses that use the word coming, and it's the Greek word Parousia, it's the Pretribbers that have to dance around the fact that Parousia is used once, but from their perspective, supposedly the Parousia is 7 years earlier than the 7-year time period in one case, and it's at the very end of the 7 years in another case. That's what he's highlighting in 2 Thessalonians 2. He says, you guys are inconsistent. What do we Prewrathers say about that same time, to this answer to what Dr. Brown says? We Prewrathers interpret this verse as the glorious, visible, noisy rapture, yes, but certainly not 7 years prior to any so-called 7-year tribulation period. And we're not doing an exposition on 2 Thessalonians at the moment, but suffice to say that 2 Thessalonians is a big problem passage for Pretribbers, because all of the language that I'm giving you the short version of the shortened, streamlined version of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. I might in the future do like a little table comparison to show you these. I do have a comparison table to show you. This is Rapture Smackdown part 1. In fact, I'll show it to you. It says Posttrib Prewrath Rapture Smackdown Part 1. Hint, whoever wins Pretrib loses. Mwah, right, my little evil LOL there. Part 1. In Part 2, what I'm going to do is show you kind of in chart form this same teaching, but just it'll be like a summary version of the differences between these two. So the reason I'm bringing that up right now is to let you know that when it comes to the book of 2 Thessalonians, the Posttribbers start to fall apart in their theology. They have to start doing a bunch of eisegeting, reading into the text, interpolating instead of extrapolating, a bunch of, assertions, assuming that Paul is not talking about the rapture when all of the details in 2 Thessalonians, that you can hear it in my voice, I'm kind of laughing. All of the details in 2 Thessalonians seem to be describing a rapture event. So the Posttribbers, again, it's a win for them. And I, as a Prewrather, am on the side of the Posttribbers. Yes, it is a rapture event that Paul's talking about, because the details mirror almost to a T what Jesus said in his Olivet Discourses about a rapture. There, again, is a rapture. So, Pretribbers, you guys got some work to do. Let's keep going. Point number 19. Jesus and Paul both speak about being gathered to the Lord at his coming, his parousia, and both in an identical end-time context. Yet Pretribbers must tell us that these identical words describing the same event are actually talking about two different events separated by 7 years. And again, this sounds like an indictment against Prewrath, which you have to remember, we also separate the rapture from the second coming, but not by 7 years. So let me bring up that chart that I created on my own. Give me a moment. Timeline. Oops. I want this. I want to show you. Give me a moment. Here we go. If I go to this chart, I'll make this larger in post-production. Well, I can do it right here now. Now, let me just go like this for a second. I'll just open it up in my browser. That's bigger for you. If we look at this chart, I created this chart. This is a zoom in of this chart. So it's this chart, but only this part of this chart. So in the lower left corner, lower right corner, you can see I've circled in red the part of the chart that you're going to be seeing here in the next slide is just the part where we got the rapture, then the wrath of God or the day of the Lord, and then the second coming at the far end. So if I look at that part right there in this view, so again, this is not the full 7 years. This is just the part that is the two events that are wrapped around the day of the Lord.